Throughout 2022's various seasons, Bleach made its comeback, Attack on Titan began its final season for the second time, while Demon Slayer, My Hero Academia, and Kaguya-sama all got fresh new seasons. The long-awaited adaptations of Chainsaw Man and Spy Family came to fruition, while Part 6 of JoJo came to its conclusion. There were even some curveballs thrown in there like Bocchi the Rock, which I think caught pretty much everybody off guard. And then there's obviously a whole bunch of other animes that did really well for themselves, but I can't be bothered to completely list off here. So, during a year like this, of course my most anticipated anime would be Arknights, Prelude to Dawn. I didn't even play the game for most of the year, but Amiya is one of, if not my favorite character designs of all time, and I remembered some of the images seen on the game's loading screen being pretty cool, and that alone was a good enough reason for me to really look forward to this. It helps a lot that I didn't have much of a pre-established attachment to most of those aforementioned series and many others, but still. I installed Arknights back during the global launch in January of 2020 after hearing about it from some friends. I played it for about 3 days, pulled Exuciai on my first try to prove a point before stopping, then proceeded to uninstall the game a few months later. Time skip ahead to 2022, where I reinstalled it sometime in the first half of the year with a fresh account, goodbye Exuciai, then played it for about a week, maybe more than that, before stopping again. Fast forward a couple months after that to just before the anime was going to air its first episode, and I started playing Arknights again because of the anime coming soon, and have consistently played the game since. This arduous tale of playing and quitting and playing again and quitting again before playing again matters for this video because it highlights the gaps in my experience with the game, which most notably impacts my experience of the game's story. I'd be a big liar if I said that I was ever super invested in the story during those periods, and those massive gaps in playtime ended up doing away with anything I might have remembered of the story. Conveniently enough, the reason why I quit my second time was because I got hard stuck on 3-8, which just so happens to be where the anime ends its story. It sounds like bullshit, I know, but that's the truth. As a result, going into the anime, all I remembered were two things: a major location that a good chunk of the story would take place in, as well as the name of a character that the story in that location would revolve around. To put it broadly, I think Prelude to Dawn was a good test run for its already announced sequel. The story is good, and most of its problems are related to presentation, which gives me hope that things can be ironed out for the second season. We're going to start getting into spoilers soon, so if that's of concern to you, then you've been warned in advance. World building is a big part of the Arknights experience, and I think it's very important to discuss it in this video. If you've played the game to any meaningful degree, then you'll know that the setting contains several different regions with several different factions, each having their own unique policies and perspectives on handling the state of Terra, the continent, I guess, that the entirety of Arknights takes place within. Nomadic cities, Eripathy, the infected population, and catastrophes are just ever-existing factors in the world that all the events are morphed by. I'm not gonna pretend like I'm an expert on this matter. I think the most credit I could give myself is that I just have the minimum baseline level of knowledge regarding some of the core tenets of the Arknights world, which mostly just means some of the things that show up on the game's starting load-up screens. So, how does the anime go about handling this? I'm sure we've all heard the phrase, show not tell, or show don't tell, or show versus tell, or whatever other variation of it you prefer. It simply boils down to showing what happened and not just saying what happened. Over time, I've grown a little weary of this phrase since I think time and place matters when it comes to showing versus telling, and obviously execution of the situation plays a big part in this too, but it's still a generally good enough rule of thumb to follow. Exposition is a sizable part of Prelude to Dawn's world building. Information about things like the discrimination against the infected, originium clusters, Eripathy, arts, nomadic cities, and Rhodes Island are all explained for the viewer to enjoy. If I put myself in the shoes of the Doctor, who barely counts as the main character, this would indeed be the most practical method of getting all the necessary information across to me. I would be an amnesiac, so having the information be delivered to me in the most direct and straightforward manner would be greatly appreciated. But I'm not the Doctor, I'm a viewer. I understand the purpose of a character intended to be a self-insert, but I'd reckon that most people watching this anime are already going to be familiar with the source material to some degree. And while I can't speak for people watching this anime that aren't familiar with the source material, I can't imagine that this highly efficient but uninteresting method of delivery really draws that specific category of viewer in, even if they may not take up a relevant enough percentage of the anime's total viewership numbers. However, as I sifted through clips and episodes again in order to piece together this script, There ended up being more moments of illustrated world building than I initially remembered. What I thought was mostly telling and not enough showing ended up being closer to like a nice 50-50 spread. There are some sections that are a little more dominated by telling than it is showing, but the first impressions that I had of Prelude to Dawn did not hold up as I kept going back and rewatching these scenes. There's a handful of moments throughout the anime where the world building is set into motion and put on full display. Episode 1 contains my favorite moment in the entirety of Prelude to Dawn, which begins with the squad of Rhodes members finding a mother and daughter being accosted by a small group of Reunion infected. The Rhodes squad does what they do and repels the Reunion group and begins providing assistance to the mother and daughter. As Amiya is talking to the daughter to reassure her that her mother will be okay, the mother takes back her daughter. After commenting on Amiya being an infected, the mother thanks the Rhodes squad and begins to walk away from them despite Amiya's offer to take them somewhere safe. The daughter looks back and waves at the squad while Amiya barely manages to tell them to find somewhere safe to hide. Near the end of episode 1, both Amiya and Doberman address the doctor about this incident and the infected, and while I kinda hate doing this, I feel like the most effective method of getting this information across would be to simply repeat what my subtitle said almost verbatim, so here it goes. Amiya, Doberman, and most of Rhodes Island's personnel are infected. There is no recorded case of infection via bodily contact, but most uninfected are afraid to come near infected. Discrimination and prejudice against the infected exists in every country, but they're especially shunned here in Ursus. Using biased reporting, the Ursus government has instilled a psychological fear of oripathy, and most people here think the infected should be exterminated. Reunion launched its insurrection to exact revenge on those who had ostracized them. Unless somebody puts a stop to it, this cycle of hatred will probably continue. I think if everything that I quoted existed purely by itself without the scene of the mother and the daughter, then I would just chalk it up as nothing but exposition and call it a day. However, most of what's said in that quote is something we just got to witness in person. Despite Rhodes Island having saved them from a dicey situation, the uninfected mother would rather risk going back into what remains of Chernobog so that her and her daughter don't need to be around infected for even a moment longer. Reunion roaming the streets and a catastrophe looming overhead is the preferred option. As the anime continues, discrimination against the infected is established as something drilled deep down into the bedrock of the world involving violence, politics, misinformation, and ignorance. Episode 1 sums a lot of this up really nicely, and even though some of this is done through exposition, I think the interaction between Amiya and the mother showcases the effects of this discrimination on a micro level that I enjoy a lot. But what about something larger? How has the present world state of Terra affected the bigger systems and players involved within it? Episode 2 opens on a TV screen playing a news report claiming that the riots in Chernobog are being put down by the quick response of Ursus guards and that peace will be restored. As the news report is playing, a fireball flies into the shot and the room containing the TV goes down in flames. It cuts to a shot of Ursus guards fleeing after being overwhelmed by Reunion forces. Ace and Doberman talk a bit about this fake news, but it eventually gets set aside once Crown Slayer's fog settles in. Again, it's another interesting example of world building in action. Just in the previous episode, Doberman called out the use of biased reporting by the Ursus government, and here it is. Clearly, the Chernobog situation is out of hand, but the reporting fabricates some good news and writes off the situation. In episode 4, we're treated with footage of infected being rejected from the doorsteps into Lungmen by heavily equipped guards, with the rejected infected being taken into custody at the behest of Inspector Chen. One of the clear defining characteristics of Lungmen is their strict anti-infected policy. In both of these cases, the scenes are addressed in relatively quick manners that get their points across without devaluing them either, and I quite like the news reports scene in particular. Just to scale things back down for a brief moment, I want to talk about Azazel Clinic. This is where the Rhodes Island squad hides for a short while after escaping from Crown Slayer and Mephisto's ambush. It's a run-down clinic in some alleyway with nobody in it that's fared just about as well as the rest of Chernobog has. It was a place for infected to secretly receive treatment that seemingly turned down offers from Rhodes Island in the past, with Ace suggesting that the clinic may have refused an offer from Reunion as well, leading to its present state. The scene tells a quick but unique story about what is ultimately an irrelevant location. It's a single drop in a much larger ocean. But this scene sticks out to me because it's another way in which how the infected are treated is contextualized and given a bit more color beyond just saying that they got it rough. It might not seem like a lot, but I really do appreciate scenes like this that make the overall picture of Terra just a tiny bit more detailed. Next are a few examples of how Prelude to Dawn adds a sense of scale to its world. During the cutaway at the halfway point of each episode, the anime shows a zoomed out map of Terra that focuses on a single point on the map where the current events are taking place. It starts with Chernobog, then Lungmen, then a quarry next to Lungmen. Adding a direct illustration of the size and shape of the landmass is pretty much the most direct way to add scale to your world. In episode 3, the surviving members of the Rhodes squad are evacuated out of Chernobog and the doctor looks out the window. This scene helps paint out the larger scale of the world, and while it is driven quite a bit by exposition thanks to Doberman, I think the shots paired alongside it do a good job at breathing some more life into her words. When the doctor looks out the window and sees the originium clusters spiking out of the ground, it's a little tricky to gauge their actual size from a bird's eye point of view. Then the plane proceeds to fly right past one, and there's this cool static shot of a massive cluster that completely dwarfs the plane. Like, if you just showed me a screen cap of that shot without telling me that there's an airplane somewhere in it, I would have never been able to see it. Looking further into the background of the same shot, you can see similar clusters spiking out of the horizon. Earlier, I used the word illustrate when talking about world building. I think that word works well here because of how the clusters paint the landscape and gives a little more texture to the otherwise empty wasteland. They also act like natural fixtures in the world as well, with how these clusters erupt to spit out originium into the sky, which in turn causes catastrophes that leave behind originium to repeat the cycle all over again. Yeah, I get that it's like a really minor thing that doesn't come up again, and the anime doesn't spend any time in the wastelands anyways, but similar to the scene in the Azazel Clinic, it's something that adds that little extra splash of details into a facet of the world. During this same explanation about originium clusters, there's also the mention of nomadic cities, and I'm going to preface this bit of the video by saying that while this is the most disappointing aspect of the anime to me, I also think my expectations were unreasonably set. Nomadic cities are cities that are entirely designed to be mobile so they can move out of the way of catastrophes. Lungmen would be the main example in Prelude to Dawn. The concept here is very cool and is a really unique component of the Arknights world. However, I think what the anime is lacking here is not being able to properly visualize the scale of these nomadic cities. We understand that these are big, but just how big are they? I talked about how the anime gives a sense of scale to originium clusters and how much I like that, and I would have loved to see that be repeated here since, as I just said, I really enjoy the concept of nomadic cities. Episode 4 sees the introduction of Lungmen, and this is where part of the disappointment stems from. All we've seen of Terra so far is what remains of Chernobog and the vast wastelands dotted with clusters. So when the elevator to Lungmen passes the threshold and Lungmen cityscape suddenly comes into view, it's clearly intended to set a massive contrast to the remainder of the world. It's a shiny metropolis that even has its own harbor, and Amyu's reaction to seeing it for the first time really tops off the reveal. Despite the desolation that has taken apart large portions of Terra, there still exists massive, flourishing communities that thrive within it. But as I've already said, the problem here is that the anime fails to fully convey the proper scale of a nomadic city. All we get to see of the city is shown in episode 4, the skyscrapers, the harbor, and some streets. The remainder of the time spent in Lungmen is caught up in the slums, whose drab concrete buildings are outlined with old pipes, wires, and rusty sheet metal while their interiors are falling apart. There's a claustrophobic air to the slums, but that's not to say that the slums are tiny by any means. By looking at some of the streets you can see during Chen transporting Misha or the rooftop escapade, you can tell that the slums are quite sizable, so if the slums are at least of a respectable size, surely the metropolis must also be quite big if it can hold the skyscrapers and harbors. But when looking at every single shot of Lungmen, there's pretty much no way to actually gauge the size of this place because there is no point of comparison. I know that what I just said is going to come off as hypocritical since I'm supposed to be complaining about how the anime doesn't scale Lungmen properly and then mention how the slums are clearly sizable and then even assume that the city must be big too. Please understand that my complaints about this aren't targeted towards Lungmen itself, but rather the concept of nomadic cities itself. I don't know why it says the Lungmen in this sentence, but okay. Even if the slums and city are scaled well enough, there's still a whole other half to this equation that's been left behind. I'm sure some people listening to this are already thinking to themselves, why does this shit even matter? And the truth is that it doesn't matter. I said earlier that my expectations for nomadic cities are unreasonable, and it's because everything that I wanted out of nomadic cities in the anime are largely pointless to the overall product. My eyes and ears were already focused on the anime's world building thanks to some great scenes in the first 3 episodes, and when they brought up nomadic cities while setting up a sense of scale in their world through visualizing the sense of originium clusters, My mind immediately went to imagining a shot of a massive nomadic city rumbling to life as it began its journey. In episode 3, we get to see a shot of Rhodes Island, which looks like a big factory. It's not quite a nomadic city, but it's still pretty big, and in this episode we get to see it roll across the wasteland towards Lungmen. So obviously I couldn't help but continue imagining just that, but with something bigger and far more elaborate. The entrance to Lungmen proper did nothing but balloon those expectations once the looming skyscraper and that forsaken harbor came into view. I want to so badly be set free inside the city streets of Lungmen and get to explore this place, but the anime doesn't have any incentive to fulfill those wishes since the story stands to gain very little if anything from it. There's no reason for Lungmen to start mobilizing right now. There's no reason for the anime to show off much of the city when only a very small slice of the story takes place there. Disappointment always stems from a comparison of results and expectations, but in this instance, I feel more than comfortable with saying that my disappointment with nomadic cities were entirely an issue of expectations and not so much the results. Okay, so, hi folks, I was just editing and then I came upon this part of the video and thought about it a little bit until I realized, I've realized these following thoughts. The best way that I can describe the whole equation shit that I just talked about is that the anime does a decent job at showing the city half of nomadic cities, but not the nomadic half, and that's what frustrated me the most. If you just took the clips of Lungmen that we got to see from the anime without prior knowledge of the existence of nomadic cities, I don't think anybody would be able to tell that this is actually a nomadic city and that we were just on like a regular ground level city, and that's it. This unique aspect of Arknights simply just isn't showcased properly, and Lungmen was their one opportunity to do it, and they didn't do it, so I guess pretty much take that as a TLDR for that whole delirious rant that you just went through, which, yeah, sorry about that, but I just had to get it out there. Okay, back to the video. We've talked exclusively within the confines of the first 4 episodes so far, and there's a decent reason for that. I'd say that world building in Prelude to Dawn is at its peak during these episodes. Once we get past episode 4, the anime pivots focus into a much more character-based narrative, and even by the end of episode 4, you can already clearly tell that things are starting to taper off. Once Misha is introduced, the story begins to revolve entirely around her and the parties tasked with locating her. Due to this shift, world building simply isn't an important aspect of these episodes, and maybe it's because of this shift that I really found my interest in the anime dropping during these episodes. I like Exusii and Texas, and especially their introductions, but they alone weren't enough to fill the vacancy left by the lack of focus on world building. Part of me wants to say that episode 1 is the culprit here because of how much I enjoyed the scene of the mother refusing to come to Rhodes. I don't want to say that episode 1 set the standard too high for world building in the anime, but I do think that it pulled a disproportionate amount of my attention to that topic. As long as I was getting more pieces of world building, you had my attention, but when there's a noticeable lack of it, then my attention begins to wander away. There's more to this than just a lack of world building that we'll get to later, but this certainly is the primary reason why episodes 5 and 6 were my least favorite episodes of Prelude to Dawn. The first half of episode 7 is a great return to form that, in my opinion, is almost on par with what we got out of episode 1. It's just a little too exposition heavy to go above and beyond what episode 1 had, but it's still quite good. It's finally a chance for the story to be explained from the reunion side of things. I think it starts great with Ivan, a regular reunion grunt who just acts like a normal person. His friendly mannerisms are what really stand out here, since the only behavior seen out of reunion grunts so far has been nothing but mindless aggression. It's a very short but humanizing moment that not only lowers Misha's guard, but also helps pique the viewer's interest in a way that isn't purely associated with violence for once. Skull Shatterers, which is a stupid and cumbersome name by the way, Skull Shredder was just better. Skull Shatterers' explanation about Reunion's worldview also puts things in a much more clear way. Reunion's rebellion being caused by discrimination of the infected is a pretty simple but effective enough motivation, and what I find to be so much more fascinating is Reunion's view of Rhodes Island. Skull Shatterer marks them as traitors, which contradicts Misha having directly witnessed their charity in action. Back in episode 2, Tallulah calls out Rhodes for being idealists, and Yeah, she's right. The ultimate goal for Rhodes is to try and create a world in which the infected can be a part of society again without facing the discrimination they currently do. In order to do this, it requires cooperation with both sides, the infected and the non-infected. Both are showcased in the anime with mentions of Rhodes treating the infected, as well as their partnership with Lungmen. For Reunion, an organization formed by the victims of this discrimination, Rhodes' cooperation with the non-infected must absolutely be betrayal to them because of the number of infected personnel working for Rhodes. Again, the partnership with Lungmen stands out to me because of Lungmen's notably harsh treatment of the infected seen by both the scene of the infected being denied at the gate as well as the existence of the slums and how vastly it contrasts against the pristine nature of Lungmen proper. This is the kind of world building that got me excited in episode 1, and I'm really happy that it's back for episode 7. 5 and 6 definitely left me unsatisfied in this respect, and I also talked earlier about how episode 4 you can start to see that tapering happening. In general, I don't think there's any character that stands out head and shoulders above the rest. Naturally, there's more to discuss about Amiya and Misha given that they get the most screen time in Prelude to Dawn, with Chen and the Doctor right behind those two. None of the minor characters are too interesting aside from providing a decently mixed bag of personalities, and while we're on the topic of characters, since I'll never have a good spot to say this in the rest of the video, let's go Firewatch, let's go Cardigan, let's go Cruz. Yeah, let's go Cruz. And lastly, let's not go Beanstalk because I don't think she was in the anime, which means that I'm understandably furious because we didn't get a whole episode dedicated to learning how to breed metal crabs with Beanstalk, which is why I'm giving Prelude to Dawn a negative 10 out of 10. Amiya is obviously the character that I had my eyes on the entire time, and she's fine. Episode 1 did a lot for her by establishing her as the leader of Rhodes, then having Doberman challenge that fact when they try to decide what to do about the mother and daughter. She's soft-spoken, doesn't have a super headstrong personality, or even a particularly assertive way of presenting herself, so how this pairs together with her position as a leader was something I was keen on seeing more of since her interaction with Doberman in episode 1 showcased it well. Unfortunately, this isn't something that comes up much after this point. Episode 4 does it a bit during the negotiations in Lungmen with Doctor, Mr. Wei, Chen, and Keltasit, with how everybody besides the Doctor plays their cards to try and get everything they want. Amiya does so by requesting a third stipulation to be added to the contract that impresses both Wei and Kalsit. I especially enjoyed how Wei played the situation by acknowledging the need for Rhodes Islands' help while addressing the fact that Rhodes needs this contract too for whatever that second unstated stipulation may be. In general, I think Mr. Wei is a very cool character, but he doesn't appear after this episode, so I guess it's kind of hard to judge him on anything besides those first impressions. It's a really good scene that plays well for all of the characters present. Again, except for the Doctor. The final example of a challenge to Amiya's leadership is in episode 8, but we'll talk about that in a moment. For now, I'll just say that I also really like that scene and watching Amiya's handling of the expectations and responsibilities of leadership juxtaposed against other leaders in Arknights made for a number of interesting interactions. It's a bit of a shame that we don't get to see more of this, but I suspect that part of the reason I actually enjoyed those scenes as much as I did was probably because there weren't very many of them, and also, I love the way Amiya says, that shit is like music to my ears. Misha is the other name in Prelude to Dawn, and similar to Amiya, she's generally fine with a couple moments worth noting. The anime plays out her concept well. She's unintentionally become the center of attention for both Lungmen and Reunion, not because of what she's done, but because of who she is. Pretty much everyone within the slums becomes swept up in the search for Misha, and Misha herself has a change of heart in both directions when learning about each side. All of this is good, and I don't have any issues with it. Amiya killing Skullshatter at the end of episode 7 is the big turning point for both of these characters, and I think it's where both of these characters peak in Prelude to Dawn. Amiya's reaction to her killing Skullshatter is great, and I think the doubt that settles into her really sells the consequences of her action, with her facial expressions also being a big contributor to this. In particular, I quite like how Chen directly addresses her once Amiya's communication with Misha is cut, with her confronting Amiya about the responsibility that comes with leadership. Chen and her military-grade short shorts have been the most important non-Amiya leader figure in the anime since she establishes a consistent leadership presence for Amiya to be measured up against. Chen is strong-willed and assertive, while Anya is shown to be vulnerable to hesitation and letting her emotions get the best of her. As far as other leaders are concerned, all of the reunion ones appear too sporadically and too briefly, and while Skull Shatterer gets the most screen time, his leadership qualities aren't the focus of his character. The only two other characters you could mark down as a leader would be Mr. Wei and the Doctor, with the latter being too much of a self-insert to retain any degree of a solid personality. And then I already spoke earlier about how Wei doesn't have enough of a runtime besides his first impressions, and that it's hard to make any sweeping statements about him outside of him wheeling and dealing contracts. This scene at the start of episode 8 is another instance in which Amya's softer personality in conjunction with her role as a leader clashes with other personalities throughout Arknights, and I think this is the best one, with how Chen's disappointment and Amya's hesitation comes through strongly. It's not a big twist or anything since the anime very strongly hints towards it coming up, but watching how the reunion troops suddenly be revitalized at the reappearance of Skull Shatterer was a cool moment for me. Misha donning her brother's gear to fool everyone else into thinking he was back, then handing off the flare gun to signal the troops to leave was a great way to peak Misha's character arc. She remained helpless for so much of the anime and finally finds it in herself to enter the fray once her brother is killed by Anya and tries to go out in the same way that her brother did too in an attempt to land one last devastating blow. It's a massive shame that the impact that Misha's death should have had was greatly softened by the anime's treatment of action. I'm pretty sure what actually happened was that Chen fatally stabs her and Misha bleeds out on the spot, but what it ends up looking like is that Chen just lightly tackles her and Misha passes out. And I think that makes for a good transition to talk about the action in the anime. It's not very good. I've said it a billion times before across many other videos, but I don't really have an eye for animation besides knowing that I like something versus that I don't, and I know that I don't really like what's going on here. The action is serviceable, I guess, but in a world where conflict is ever present, something about the action just doesn't leave a mark. And it's not like it's political conflict where people are just angrily looking at each other across desks and through monitors either. It's violent conflict with people drawing weapons and entire cities being set ablaze. I think what's really putting me off about the action is this weird aversion to fully commit to it. There's magic and crossbows and both sharp and blunt weapons and even bombs, but most of the casualties amount to people getting hit, going, and then falling over. That's it. Now, I'm not saying that there needs to be blood and guts flying left and right like this is Edge Runners or some shit, but there's a serious lack of weight to these scenes. And sure, you could maybe chalk this up to them literally wiping down waves of reunion grunts, so trying to extensively choreograph each and every reunion takedown would most likely end up in a lot of wasted effort. The moments in which we get to see the big names join the fray are a bit more of a mixed bag, but these still peak at good but never great. W intercepting Chen in episode 6 is more of the same, since it's just Chen kicking and slashing through the same old reunion grunts, but this time W is cackling on the sidelines while throwing grenades and detonating mines. The Rhodes squad falling into Crown Slayer and Mephisto's trap in Chernobog is janky as all fuck, because Mephisto is commanding around the grunts like they're on a chessboard with C5 this and B6 that. This jankiness was also present with the Doctor commanding the Rhodes squad in episode 1, and while I can appreciate the commitment to the source material, I just want to say that I also appreciate that this sort of commanding isn't a regular part of the anime and is dropped shortly after the first 2 episodes. Also, Mephisto just talks too much. he just won't shut up during the entire thing, and none of what he says is interesting enough, but I do like Neural's entrance though. But again, I just like Neural in general, so I think I'm hella biased on this one, but cool, I like that character. Tallulah's introduction at the end of episode 2 is fucking awesome, and it seemed like it was going to build up to a great fight in the following episode, but that's all gone to nothing. Amiya blocks Tallulah's fire blast, and while that admittedly looks very cool, they pretty much immediately go into full-on retreat mode, which is understandable from a perspective of rationality, but I can't help but feel disappointed by the lack of substantial action here because of how sick that ending to episode 2 was. Skull Shatterer briefly throws it down against Hoshiguma near the end of episode 7, and this is probably the only one of these important people fights that I have no complaints about, since it's just a couple quick shots of Hoshiguma bullying Skull Shatterer before he outsmarts her by targeting the bottom of her triangular shield, which you gotta think must be something that happens regularly simply due to the nature of the shield's design, but maybe Hoshiguma really is just that good. And that's it for Prelude to Dawn. Arknights Perish to Frost has already been announced, and love the name, by the way. All in all, I'm cautiously optimistic for Perish to Frost. The exposition that weighed down parts of the first half of Prelude to Dawn was completely gone in the second half, and as long as the anime wasn't focusing on its action, the character interactions and story moments were consistently interesting. If they insist on keeping the action as clean as they did in Prelude to Dawn, then there needs to be some sort of reworking of the action's presentation to add weight to it. Maybe they could completely water down all scenes of people beating up grunts and keep those to a minimum, then put more resources into important fights between named characters and try to make those stand out. I'm not knowledgeable enough about anime direction, scene compositions, and various other things like that to suggest any methods of doing so, but it is something that does need to happen. Last, but definitely not least, I would also like to see more forms of world building in action like shown in episodes 1, 2, and 7. I'll be keeping my eye out for Perish to Frost, and I hope the presentation will take the necessary step up to push the anime from fairly good to being great. If you enjoyed this video, then consider liking it and maybe even subscribing to the channel. Every little bit of support goes a long way for a fledgling channel such as mine. So, just a couple extra notes here. Well, actually, it's a lot more substantial than the usual extra notes. Think of this as bonus content for the video, I guess. It's like DLC. So you thought that the deranged rant about nomadic cities earlier on in the video was all you were going to hear of that, and you were wrong, because I'm going to do it again here, but this time I don't have a script in front of my face, so it's going to be even worse. Okay, so I'm going to pull up two images on screen here, well, one at a time, that is. So the first one is, well, if you Google Arknights nomadic cities, then one of the first links that should pop up is one for the fandom wiki page for, well, the Arknights fandom wiki page for nomadic cities, and on that page is this image. The file name says that it's concept art, which I'm just gonna take that for what it is. So it's concept art, but just like when I discovered this picture, I felt like all my grievances with nomadic cities in the anime were just like completely justified. Like, I feel like that entire section on nomadic cities would have just been like completely condensed into, yeah, this shit's pretty fucking cool. If we just had like this, like a shot of this in the anime, just like a bird's eye view of like Lungmen is all I could have asked for. I think that would have completely solved my problem. Just like how sick is this shit? Just look at it. Each one of these are fucking massive, but then there's 3 big ones. Like, I assume all the little ones there are like little connector pieces or just little utility segments of the nomadic city. But like they're all just like one big chunk. It's just like, imagine these things like rolling across. There's like, you can see like a lake closer to the center of the image itself, just above like the first major chunk. And then there's like what looks almost like small mountain ranges or like hills or like the sides of valleys even, and just like those things are completely dwarfed by the existence of these cities. It's just like, look at how detailed the cities inside are. There's like, what is that? Is that like a lake in the middle, like a little triangle lake in the middle, and then there's like the 3 major roadways connecting it, but like each section of like the major city is clearly distinct. Like down near the bottom of the first city, you can see like there's a lot of skyscrapers, so that's clearly like the metropolitan area, like the downtown, like the ones we saw in Lungmen. And then off to the left side of that same first one, there's not only like another tiny triangle right there, probably another lake, a big fan of triangles, but it's like everything is like a lot lower, but it's still like the same grayish tone. So it's like, maybe this is like a residential area, like a suburb, or like this could be an industrial zone with a lot of factories where they don't need to necessarily build super tall, but they do need to build super wide. And then like to the right side, there's like a lot more greens and blues, so you could think of this as like, maybe this is like a nature reserve, or this is like a harbor, even like who knows, maybe it could be a harbor or like an agricultural section, like just like it's so varied, there's so much color going on, there's just like so much texture to the city by itself, and this is just like one, there's fucking three of them, and like the big one to like the left over there has like all those like reddish buildings that look like they're made out of bricks, so I'm sure that's like a completely different aesthetic, and same goes for the one on the right too, just like how cool is this shit, like, oh god. And then just in that same wiki page, there is like a list of notable nomadic cities within the game. And while I initially considered bringing up the picture of Salviento, which I guess I'll just throw that up here just for like a quick point of reference, which is cool, by the way. I think Salviento looks very cool, but like the angle of the image here is a little awkward since you kind of can't see a large chunk of the city by itself because of like the big half arch things coming up from the right side, but still really cool. Also like a really cool perspective shot, by the way. Shout outs to Scotty. I think that's Scotty in the picture. But this one, this is for the nomadic city of Shangshu, and this blows my mind even more so than the one we just saw, because not only is it like those like skyscrapers, so it's like another rebuild of the metropolis that we saw earlier, but look at, there's like just mountain peaks built there. Like, are these mountain peaks supposed to be a part of, I have to imagine they're part of the nomadic city, because I can't really see any like of like the bottom layer of the nomadic city here. Like on the first image, there's like those big like tank wheels you can see going on in the bottom, just like rolling across the entire thing. But like on this one, you don't see any of that shit. So I have to assume everything in this is in like the interior. And just like look at how cool this is. There's like those mountain ranges that are so tall, like they're like covered in clouds. Like you can see Cruz, and I don't know who else that is, but I know my Cruz when I see her. I hope. But you can see like their vision is like covered with fog because they're up so high, and like the clouds are obscuring their vision. And then like there's still like the big lake in the middle, and then there's like those two highways coming on each side of the lake, so that's big. You can even see like a little like terraced farm right there, which I think, by the way, terraced farms are really cool. But just like look at how cool this shit is. Like, how big does a fucking nomadic city have to be if you can not only contain like a metropolis, but also fucking mountain ranges that go so high that clouds obscure the tops of them? Like, come on. Just like, this is what I'm talking about when I say, like, the proper scale of a nomadic city. These things must be fucking massive, but the anime doesn't show it at all. Like, we just get to go like the claustrophobic basement area of fucking Lungmen with like the slums, which like it's kind of interesting, but like, come on, like it doesn't compare to this shit. Just like, please, I beg you, and perish to frost, can we just get something even remotely like this? Like, it can just be like 5 seconds of just like a still shot and just like people are talking. Like, make it be like a fucking flashback, or like the doctor's looking at the helicopter window again for whatever reason. Just like, please, just something like this. I beg you. Like, this is what I'm talking about. This is what I was missing the entire time. Like, once I saw these pictures, I knew that my grievances were sort of justified, and not like completely justified, but I felt less shitty about feeling bad for those things once I saw like what could have been. God, it's so, oh my god, these images are so cool. God, it's shit like this. That's why I was just like love like the scale of the world building in Arknights. I think it's so cool. Nomadic cities are such an amazing idea. Just please capitalize on it for Perish to Frost. So, okay, all right, I'm done. That's like, okay, nomadic cities, we're done here. The only like last minor note I have is I think the opening for the anime is pretty cool. The opening, like the animation itself used for the opening is a little janky because it just feels like a bunch of like leftover clips used from actually animating the rest of the show were just kind of like glued together to do it. Like, the song is great. I like the song a lot. But yeah, the animation used for the opening is really weird. It's not bad, but it's just like very jarring because it looks so visually just like consistent with the rest of the anime, whereas like most other animes generally tend to put a little extra flair to their openings, you know? The ending, that is, God, my brain is all fucked up right now. The ending's cool too. I like the ending music. I don't think the ending animation's okay as well. But yeah, the ending song is cool. I think I prefer the opening. more than the ending, but yeah. Okay, so that's it. I don't know what video is going to be next. I have a couple ideas that I'm juggling around, but if those videos are going to come out, it's going to take a little while because one of those, both of the major ideas that I have is content that I haven't tried before on this channel, still related to anime, but it's like a different format of content that I kind of want to take it a little slow to make sure that I can get it as close to right as possible, but yeah, don't know when it's going to be, but kind of new-ish styles of videos coming out next. So yeah, that's it. Once again, thank you so much for watching, especially suffering through that this outro rage rant about what could have been of Nomadic Cities. I just had to get it out of my system. But yeah, that's it. We're done with the video here. Said it, I think this is the third time. Thank you so much for watching. And please take it easy.
ブラックスチールワールドワイド